like to introduce Earl Wright, who is CEO of AMG National Trust Bank, to introduce our program speaker. Earl?
Thank you. President Jim, thank you. I'm standing before you today as the chair of Common Sense Policy Roundtable, which is a 501c3 that was started approximately 4 years ago to assess any public policy issues with regards to jobs and the economy in Colorado. And in forming that particular entity, we have with us also today the vice chair of that group, Buzz Coble. And many of you know Buzz and his family for many years here in Colorado. But in setting up the Common Sense Policy Roundtable, one of the things that we found out in assessing jobs and policy and state policies that would impact jobs and economy is that there was not a tool that was available that many states, and we have as a nation, that's called an econometric model of the state of Colorado. So the first thing we did was try to find a way to develop an econometric model of just the state of Colorado that as various issues came before us as a populace, how do we assess the impact of those decisions on jobs and the economy? We're very fortunate that we not only have an exceptionally strong board, but in the process of trying to answer this particular issue, we had the Denver Economic Development Agency, the Southeast Denver Economic Development Agency, and the state of Colorado came up with the funds, which are rather large, to buy this model that the state of Colorado now has, which is housed at the University of Colorado. And Brian Lewandowski is the person solely looking over that particular model and looking at the economic policy issues. And one of those policy issues that we looked at, which wasn't the first one, but is now rather relevant in today's environment, is fracking. What would happen to the jobs and the economy if we did not have, if the energy policy changed here in the state of Colorado so that fracking was either terminated and or lessened rather significantly. And with the partnership with CU's Leeds Business School and the Business Research Development Division, of which Rich Robekind heads up, of which Brian Lewandowski is a significant part of, we now have an ability with the econometric model that we have housed up there to take a look at the issue and say over a period of time, if there were a termination of fracking or there was a significant decreasing of fracking in energy development here in the state, what would we as citizens have as an impact on jobs and the economy? We are not an R or a D. We are not any political arm whatsoever. We're here to help discover what is the economic impact of these various public policy decisions. And with that, let me introduce Brian Lewandowski. Brian is a University of Montana undergrad in economics and finance. Better than that, he has strong roots from his Nebraska background, but besides that, nobody else appreciates it here, by the way, besides myself. And he also is an MBA at the Leeds School, where he had a chance to get to know Rich Wobekind and did research for him. And he has been at the Institute now for 7 years. And any of you that are really interested in all the projects, I have probably 8 pages of about 12 projects per page of economic analysis that Brian has been involved in with regards to this region, various industries. I mean, his background is unbelievable, and we're very, very fortunate to have somebody of his skill set available to update us today on this very important issue. Brian? On your table is literature that the Common Sense Policy Roundtable has taken from his research that you can look at with regards to fears and facts about fracking if you want to take that with you after his speech.
Well, thank you, Earl, and thank you, Jim, for having me here today to talk about this issue. I've got a handful of technology pieces up here. I've got my timer so I can stay on time today. I've got my clicker and my microphone, so I'm heavily using technology. So again, thanks for having me. I have been with the Business Research Division for past 7 or 8 years, and I'm following a long tradition at the Business Research Division, providing information back to Colorado citizens, policymakers, business leaders. The institution The research division itself has been around since 1915. For the past 50 years, we've been doing an employment forecast and an economic forecast for the state of Colorado. So in December, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary of that. So about a year and a half ago, the Common Sense Policy Roundtable approached us with the Denver Metro EDC, the Denver South Economic Development Partnership, and the university, and they came together and said, you know, we want someone in Colorado to take a look at these policy issues that impact the economy, and we think you're the right group to do it. So I was really honored when they reached out to us. And, you know, we're not doing anything much different than we've done in the past. We've used econometric models to study the Colorado economy. We take a look at all of these industries and try and do a deep dive to really share information about employment and GDP and the economic impacts of policy measures. But this group is extremely helpful because they're funding the model and they help guide the discussion as far as which topics we should be looking at. So today I'm here to talk about the oil and gas industry, and especially what we're seeing right now with these initiatives to scale back industry activity within the state. So I'd like to start with this map. Anyone guess what this is a map of? Okay, this is a map that you can go to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and put in an address. So this little X in the middle is my home address. And I can pull up a map that shows active wells and wells that have, oil and gas wells that have been shut in, and you can see which wells, where they are injecting water for hydraulic fracturing. So it's really fascinating. This is all open to the public. You can see how many wells are close to your work, how many are close to your schools, and how many are close to your home. And I show this for a couple reasons. One, I'm not isolated from the oil and gas industry. I'm not paid directly by the oil and gas industry. I'm not invested in the oil and gas industry, but it's very much a part of my community. And even if you don't have oil and gas wells in your backyard or on your drive to work, it's a very big piece of our economy. And that's what I'm going to start by talking with you about today. So this all started last fall after the election. As a group, we were sitting around talking about what issue we should study next. And there's this big movement for scaling back oil and gas production in city of Boulder, in Broomfield, in Fort Collins, and the year prior we saw a ban on fracking in the city of Lafayette. So at that point we were looking at the industry thinking, what's the logical next step? Perhaps it would be some sort of statewide moratorium or statewide ban on fracking. And so that's what we started to study. And as January rolled around and February rolled around, we started to see how some of this actual language was shaping up. And it really took two paths. One was a local control path, where communities have the right to decide what happens in their backyard. And the other path is increasing setbacks. The industry went through an increased setback measure about a year and a half ago, and this would increase the setbacks. The proposals ranged up to about a half a mile. Now, we've seen this get shaped even further to where there's still really a local control measure that's still got traction, and there's still a 2,000-foot setback rule that's still gaining signatures right now. But there were, roughly 20 measures that were first proposed that most were anti-industry, and 4 are pro-industry. But, as time has gone on, we've seen that really get pared back to 2 anti-industry initiatives and 2 pro-industry initiatives. And one's really a local control measure. One is the setback measure that I mentioned. And the 2 pro-industry ones, one cuts off local taxes for communities that shut down the industry. But when we started studying this, we were really focused on a statewide ban because that was the best inclination we had at the time. So what was the conclusion to our study? A statewide moratorium on hydraulic fracturing would result in economic drag on the Colorado economy. So this shouldn't really be a shocker. If you really scale back any industry, if you scale back the construction industry in Colorado or the tourism industry in Colorado, those have a constraining impact on the economy in terms of GDP or in terms of employment or wages. So that really shouldn't be the aha moment. I'll share with you the exact numbers as we get to the end of the presentation. I think it's really important to talk about the industry so that you have context of the size, the magnitude of the industry and growth rates. Colorado is very much an oil and gas, or very much an energy-producing state. When you take a look at the Energy Information Administration statistics, we are 7th in terms of total energy production nationally. We're 9th in terms of coal and 6th in natural gas and 8th in oil. These are all the most recent statistics that they have up there. And we're about 19th in renewable energy, depending on which metric you're looking at. But 75% of our energy production comes from oil and gas. Okay? A little over 20% comes from the coal industry. Renewable energy is about 3.7% of our total energy production. But you can clearly see from this chart that all of these resources have been increasing over time. When we take a look at the mining industry, I zoom out to mining because these are really the most recent statistics that are out there. We can take a look at 2013 data when we talk about mining. We can only take a look at 2012 data when we're talking about oil and gas. Historically, about 80% of GDP and 80% of employment within the mining industry is oil and gas. But this is a relatively small industry in the state. According to the 2013 GDP numbers that were released in July, 6.7% of Colorado's nominal GDP is mining. About 2.8% of total wages in the state come from mining, and 1.3% of employment comes from mining. But what's fascinating when taking a look at GDP per employee, the mining industry has about $384,000 in GDP per employee compared to about $90,000 for all industries in the state of Colorado. When you take a look at average pay within the industry, the mining industry pays more than twice the average of all other industries in Colorado. The mining industry pays second only to our company headquarters that are in the state. And when we take a look at the occupations within oil and gas specifically, many of these jobs are what I would call your field worker jobs. So I see that some of these categories didn't show up here, but these are construction and extraction jobs, installation and maintenance, production, transportation, and material moving. All of these blue shaded industries, about 60% of the pie are field workers. About 40% of the pie are more of your office type jobs, your engineers, your managers, your finance folks. And I think part of that story explains why we have such a distribution of employment across the state of Colorado when it comes to this industry. So, I think another really fascinating thing is that there is a clear concentration of industry activity within Colorado. 90% of 2013 drilling permits were in 5 counties in Colorado. 83% of the 2013 drilling permits were in 2 counties, Weld County and Garfield County. Weld County is very heavy on oil. Garfield is very heavy on gas. When we take a look at the concentration of taxable production, so you can go to the Department of Local Affairs and take a look at the information that's put out by the Division of Property Taxation. and take a look at assessed property values by county. And you can take a look at this specifically for the oil and gas industry. They report those separately because the oil and gas production has a much higher assessment ratio than residential property and then commercial property. Residential property has an assessed value of 7.96%. Commercial is 29%. But any oil and gas production is assessed at 87.5%. When you take a look at those assessed values of production across the state, 88% of that taxable value is in 5 counties. 33 other counties have some level of production. They're making up that remaining 12% of production. And then 26, 28 states have little to no taxable production. Okay, so very concentrated. But when you take a look at employment, those same 5 top producers that I just described account for 40% of industry employment when you take a look at upstream and midstream industry workers. 40%, only 40%. It's 87% of taxable production, but 40% of employment. The other 33 counties that have some production have about 30% of employment. And then the counties that have no production or very little production have another 30% of production, or of employment, excuse me. So why is that? I think a lot of it has to go back to those office jobs or those corporate jobs. The city and county of Denver is actually the largest employer. If you mine through the employment statistics, they're the largest employer of oil and gas workers in the state. When we take a look at industry growth over time, I think employment is a nice metric to look at because we can track that really nicely in a monthly time series, and I think we can relate to it a little bit more after seeing what happened during the recession. So employment in Colorado overall, when you start in 2000 to 2014, it's up about 13% or so. So it's grown 13% over that time. The mining industry has grown about 177% over that same period. And you can see what happened during the recession. The state went through 2 recessions during that time period. And during the second recession, the Great Recession, we lost about 6.4% of employment. And we have fully recovered all of those jobs now. One fascinating little tidbit, we recovered faster in terms of employment from the Great Recession than we did in the prior recession that started in December 2008. When we take a look at employment in Colorado, just starting from peak employment. So Colorado employment peaked in May of 2008. That's when we started to lose jobs after May. I mentioned we lost about 6.4% of our total employment. We've fully recouped that, and now we're pushing 4%. So we're experiencing record high employment in Colorado. The mining industry has grown about 17%, 18% from that same point. And if you take a look at employment in mining, it continued to increase even as the state was losing jobs. So the recession started, and if you think back to 2008, commodity prices continued to rise until about August or so, and then the floor fell out of commodity prices too. The industry responded, and we saw a sharp decrease in industry employment. But look what happened when the industry started to turn. A couple months later, we saw Colorado total employment start to turn, and now we're back to being one of the best performing states in the nation. In 2013, we were 4th in terms of job growth, percentage change in job growth. In 2014, Moody's Analytics projects us to be 6th in terms of job growth, and in 2015, we're projected to be 4th. We literally have one of the best performing economies in the nation. When you take a look at the 5 states who have had the best recoveries in terms of employment nationally, Colorado is 5th. The other states that have performed better than Colorado, North Dakota, Texas, Utah, and Alaska. When we take a look at employment growth from national peak employment, so we peaked in January of 2008 nationally, and just a couple months ago, we recouped all of those job losses. So now we're in this period again nationally where we're creating record levels of jobs in this country. But when you pull back the onion a little bit and take a look at the top 10 energy producing states, all energy, so oil and gas, coal, renewable energy, hydro, just looking at the EIA's top 10 energy states, those states have outperformed the nation in terms of total job growth. Those states are up over 2% from the previous peak. The other 40 states, without those top 10 states, they still have not recovered peak employment. When you add Colorado into that story, Colorado's doing even better. From that same peak, we're up about 4%. And it's not coincidental. You know, I look at the employment numbers by metropolitan area also in Colorado, and you can take a look at total recovery or total growth for any MSA in the state, whether it's Denver or Boulder or Grand Junction or Colorado Springs or Fort Collins, Loveland, Greeley. Greeley has been in the top 10 MSAs nationally. There's 300 plus metropolitan areas nationally. It's been one of the top 10 employment creators in the nation over the past 4 or 5 years. Okay? In terms of total employment recovery, it's also in the top 10. But the Fort Collins Loveland MSA is also in the top 30 or so. The Denver MSA is in the top 40 or so. When you take a look at the Denver metro region north up to Fort Collins and east out to Greeley, that area not only has faster employment growth rates, but it also has faster wage growth, lower unemployment rates, higher home appreciation rates, lower foreclosure rates. When you take a look down to Colorado Springs and even out to the western slope out in Grand Junction, those areas are still struggling to come back. They're two of the worst performing areas nationally. The industry also pays a lot of taxes. So one task that I've had over the past 4 or 5 years is estimating the total revenue stream that comes off the industry. I just estimated the 2013 numbers, and for upstream and midstream oil and gas activity, I estimated about $1.15 billion in revenue back to Colorado. So that includes state government, cities, counties, schools, in terms of severance taxes, sales taxes, production, the ad valorem tax, property taxes, income taxes. And there's also a COGCC tax that they pay to help cover the regulation of the industry. So this is severance tax, and I point this out for one reason. One, we're kind of climbing back. This is a 12-month rolling sum, so we're at about $230 million when you take a look at the total severance taxes paid over the last 12 months. That severance taxes goes back into our local communities. Part of it is statutory. It goes back to where employees live, not where they work, but the communities where they live. And another piece of it goes back to local communities through grant programs. So if you're a community in Colorado and you've been impacted by the oil and gas industry, you can apply for some funds for new roads or new bridge or something else that's been impacted by the community. But when you take a look at most of these revenue streams, they're inherently local. So Colorado doesn't have a state property tax. It's mostly schools, county, city, and special districts. Do you know that more than 50% of property taxes in Colorado goes to school districts? And so when I calculate the property tax number for 2013, it's about $360 million. So about $200 million of that goes directly back to Colorado school districts. So in terms of total employment, when we look at midstream and upstream employment, we estimate that that's about 34,000 workers directly employed by the industry, earning more than $3.5 billion in wages. All of that pretty much stays in Colorado. So that's the backdrop of the industry. And that's very fact-based. You can go out there and you can look up these numbers for yourself. You can check the employment numbers. You can look up most of these tax revenue streams. It's probably an industry that I look at that has the most public reporting out there to where you can verify industry activity. But with this study, we were asked to take a forward-looking view about what would happen if there was some sort of moratorium or ban on fracking across the state. So given that setback, that context that I just provided, it's not a big surprise that it has some sort of large negative impact on the Colorado economy. But how did we do it? So we had 43 years of historical production data on oil and on gas in Colorado. And we can see how wells perform the first year that they're drilled and then every year thereafter. And when you pull up all of this information, you see trends in the data. So this peak right here is it's our peak production as of fall 2013, and then everything thereafter is a forecast. But we can estimate that the first year is the best year as far as production, and then there's a trailing off in production of those existing wells thereafter. Using some public data, we gathered that about 95% of wells are fracked. So our assumption was if there's a ban on fracking, we would see 95% of new production go away within the state. Looking at those depletion rates, this curve that I showed you, this is for oil specifically, 40% loss in production after year one, 27% after year two, and it declines to a trailing stream of about 6.9% loss per year. The gas decline is a little more shallow, but it's still pretty steep. Your best production happens in the first couple years. So you would still have all of this legacy production from wells that have already been drilled, but what happens when we don't have new production backfilling that industry activity? And when we ran it through our econometric model that's built for Colorado and then calibrated each year with new population data, new employment data, new labor force participation data, here's what it told us when you have a statewide fracking ban. We lose on average over the period from 2014 through 2040 or so, our average loss was 93,000 jobs. So we're on this trajectory of employment growth, and you notch it down by about 93,000 jobs. That's 2.2% loss in our base employment. In terms of GDP, over that entire horizon, we lose about $12 billion in GDP. We ran this back in March, so we'd have to calibrate it again with the new GDP numbers. But it's $12 billion over that horizon. So again, we're on this trajectory of growth. Notch it down. Shift that curve down by $12 billion over that horizon. You'll see that the loss is $8 billion over the first 5 years. It grows, and then it actually decreases again. And that's because the EIA's projections for oil and gas development in this country and in Colorado have us peaking at some point around year 14 or 15 before it starts to come down to some extent. So now as we head forward into the fall and we have better information, we're continuing with our modeling exercises. I showed you the ballot initiatives around slide 5, and we know that the 2,000-foot setback is one that could be on the ballot. The local control measure could be on the ballot. And so we want to be responsive and show people what that would look like if those two issues passed. It won't be as dramatic as a statewide fracking ban. When you take a look at total population in Colorado, 60% of our population lives within the Denver metro region. About 78% lives along the Front Range from Fort Collins down to Pueblo, excluding Weld County. But that region only has 1.8% of our oil production, and it only has 0.6% of our gas production. So we have this concentration of our populace, but very little industry activity within that region. But that's one thing we could model under a local control measure, is taking a look at what would happen, like we've already seen up in Boulder County, Larimer County, and Broomfield, what would happen if these population centers decided to ban fracking if this local control measure went through. The 2,000-foot setback view, we have some information from the increased setback rules a year and a half ago that will help inform how much production could be lost if the 2,000-foot setback gets passed, and we'll model that scenario as well. But really, we're trying to be responsive and provide timely information back to the public about what some of these ballot issues could mean for the state. So that's all that I have. Do I have time to open it up for questions?
Well, thank you, Brian. My first question before we get others, and please raise your hand if you do have a question. And I realize that you weren't brought here to do a political forecast, but what do you think the chances are, realistically, that there might be a fracking ban or a ban in those counties that are so important to the industry?
I don't want to speculate on what what the likelihood is of those measures. I think what's telling is the signature gathering, though. I think on the anti-fracking measures, those seem to be very grassroots, and from what I'm told, the two anti-fracking measures are finding success in gathering enough signatures for it to be a ballot issue. So I think that makes them real possibilities of being on the ballot. Then we'll see what happens from there.
Okay. Christy, yes, go ahead. Andre?
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. So if I understood correctly, you said we're the 7th largest energy-producing state, but it's a tiny sliver of our economy. And as risk of sounding as ignorant maybe as the governor of Alaska who could see Russia, I'm going to be as ignorant and say, doesn't Alaska have no state taxes and maybe even a dividend from oil? So how far would we have to grow our oil revenues to get there?
To get a dividend? Well, that's a great question that I don't have an answer to. But I mean, I think that if you take a look at the growth in the industry and what it's meant for public revenues in Colorado, Colorado has a budget structure that's really complicated, including Tabor and Amendment 23 and the Gallagher Amendment. And I think for a handful of reasons, we can at least say that the revenue stream that comes off oil and gas has helped cushion us from other structural problems that we otherwise would have in the absence of that money. Remember last fall there was a ballot initiative for education to raise $1 billion a year in income taxes. And I talked about just the revenue stream that comes off oil and gas activity for schools at $200 million in 2013. Imagine school finance if we didn't have that revenue stream. And there's additional revenue that goes into the state coffers in terms of income taxes and sales taxes. That also ends up back in the schools. So I don't know what would have to take place for us to get a dividend check every year, but the structure of state finances in all of these states is very different.
All right, good. Yes, another one in the back.
Hey, thank you very much for being here. Great presentation. I had somebody ask me earlier, and they said, what exactly is fracking, and what does it do? So can you give us the Reader's Digest version?
Sure. So, in a very general sense, they drill holes into the ground, and They mix together a large amount of sand and water and some other chemicals. They pump it into the ground at very high pressures and break the rocks that are far underground. So it helps release the oil and the gas that's trapped in those rocks. So this innovation has allowed us to tap into resources that we couldn't get out before. So prior to fracking, which has been around since the 60s, but it's really come to fruition within the past 10 years. That's when we've really seen a ramp up in this activity. But prior to that, the companies would look for a pool of oil and gas. Now they're able to tap into resources that otherwise weren't accessible. And they're also able to go into other wells that they've shut in because that pool had been depleted, and they're able to fracture those wells as well and extract additional resources that were trapped in areas where they had already pulled oil and gas from.
Yes.
Maybe there's a lawyer here that can explain it, but I just heard on NPR that some court ruled that local control over fracking is against the rules. It's a statewide deal. Did anyone else hear that?
So that's been a piece of the discussion. Maybe someone else wants to answer this, but that's been a part of the discussion since the beginning. That's why the court recently ruled against Longmont last week or 2 weeks ago, but the judge put a stay on the order while this can go up further in the food chain to higher courts. But the oil and gas industry is the right to extract these resources has been under state control throughout our history. And so that's the argument. Can a local community circumvent that state rule and say that these resources can't be taken out? But I think the courts have a lot of deciding to do on that topic.
Okay, one last question. Brian, do you have one back there? Christy, any? Okay. Oh, yes, we do have one more. Question was, in other states, there's an apparent association between earthquakes and fracking, or at least speculation.
Yeah, so I've read about this as well, and I've talked with industry folks about this. If you go to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation site, they have an area called Library where you can see the staff reports. And they even talk about the earthquake activity. On NPR, I was driving into work today, and they were talking about earthquake activity in Oklahoma. I don't think that the industry is shying away from the idea that fracking and earthquakes can be connected. I mean, they're pumping volumes of resources into the ground and breaking rocks, so there are tremors associated with that. In Oklahoma, which is a very pro-industry state and a low regulation state, this is what they were saying on NPR, the regulators have said, let's shut in those wells for a period of time and then allow you to restart again, and we'll just increase monitoring on the activity. There was also an earthquake or a series of earthquakes up in Weld County a couple months back, and they took a similar approach. From what I've been told is there's areas that are more susceptible to earthquakes, and if you do the fracking too shallow, you increase the likelihood of these tremors happening. But I mean, all of that's based on what I've read. But I haven't necessarily heard the industry saying that there's no causation there. I think that's a good example of a place for the regulators to be involved and say, if we experience this activity, then we won't allow you to do it here, or we have to pause for a while and do it here. But that's where the COGCC should be involved.
Let's give Brian a big hand for his presentation today.